I thought instead of just doing like the standard banter about, hey, what are you seeing around you? Because I think, I'm getting some echo now. Because I think a lot of the stuff is sort of the same every couple of weeks. Maybe we could take a look at just some stuff from, around the country in slide form while we wait for folks to file in. So maybe get your reaction to some of the stuff. You've seen Mark, you track a lot of what's happening in the broader economy and just sort of the world at large. Actually, I thought this was a pretty interesting chart, and I realize now that I should have labeled this a little bit better. I think the label's cut off, but the pink columns over here are the current by state unemployment rate as of the end of this October. And the blue lines are where it was October a year ago. So you can sort of see the progress that was made. And I guess there's probably two observations here, two things you would look for. One is just how much that number has come down over the course of the year. And two, sort of the sequential order or the ranked order of various states, those that have still higher levels of unemployment versus the ones that have the lowest level. So the pink again is October 2021. The blue line is October 2020. Again, this isn't the core of what we're talking about today, but I thought it was interesting. Do you see anything in here, Mark, that's worth commenting on?
Well, yeah, I mean, just some of those spikes around, the ones around Hawaii and Nevada kind of made sense to me just because of the special circumstances around how tourist dependent they were, and how heavily concentrated with restaurants they were. So it makes sense that they are kind of recovering from quite a high base of unemployment. But some of those I wouldn't have expected to see, like some of these peaks around, Tennessee and North Carolina, Georgia. That did surprise me. But as we go from left to right, it tends to be a little bit more kind of warm state, red state to cold state, blue state. That kind of tracks.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about for last October, the peaks that we're seeing.
Correct.
Yeah, but the thing that's interesting is if you think about labor and unemployment, we hear about headline unemployment rates all the time, and I think the number is sort of in the low fours right now, which is historically not bad. But you then sort of look too at labor force participation, which sort of tells you a slightly different story, right? Labor force participation is the percentage of people that are actually in the job market or the labor force. And this number has been declining for a long time now. And with COVID, we saw, a massive drop virtually overnight. But even with the recovery that we've seen over the last, 20 months or however long it's been, we're still not really close to where we were pre-pandemic, right? But I think the other thing I'd noticed that we've just been going down for a long time too, right? We went from 60.
And I wonder what's the highest it's ever been.
I think if you go back a little bit further, you get a couple of extra percentage points above and beyond that. And if you look at the stuff demographically, it's interesting. The sharpest decline, I think, over the past couple of decades has actually been in younger people, like ages, I guess, 16 to 20, I think is that's the cohort they break out. I guess that sort of makes sense. I mean, did you work when you were in high school?
Yeah, I started working in the summers when I was 14.
Yeah. So is it less common for kids today to work when they're in high school? It seems like it from the numbers that I saw.
I think it would seem that way. A lot of, I think, at least a lot of people that I know whose kids are older than mine, that are kind of in the high school range. A lot of them are heavily into activities like a competitive cheerleading or a travel softball or something like that is going to cut down on working opportunities. But I mean, at least from what Allison and I talked about, like we're going to encourage the kids to work probably, either before ninth grade or somewhere after ninth grade.
It's interesting. I mean, and I don't think we don't have any hard data on this, but I guess just a matter of personal observation. It seems like with the labor shortage, I'm seeing a lot more high school age kids working at the local fast food restaurant than I ever remember. right? It seems like there's still a ton of new employees, and you're seeing, high school kids basically coming for some of those jobs. But again, that's just my personal observation. I don't know if any of you out there have seen anything similar, but certainly looks like it just from casual observation.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think when the pandemic's over, I think that would be a great option. I would certainly encourage that. I think everybody needs to work in the food service industry for a little bit.
And for all of you just joining us, we're not really officially live yet. We're just sort of just casually talking about some stats that we thought were sort of interesting. We'll get into the actual webinar in just a few moments. I thought this was interesting, and this actually is counter to what my intuition had been, which is if you look at states and you plot them not just by their level of unemployment, but also by the labor participation rate, I expected there to be some sort of correlation, right? That there'd be a sort of straightish line, pointing in either up and to the right or down and to the right. But you don't really have that. The states are sort of scattered all over the place. Now you do have a couple of standout states, Nebraska, Utah, and South Dakota, that have a high level of labor participation and a low level of unemployment, relatively speaking. But you don't really have like a straight line anywhere. It's really just sort of scattered everywhere, which sort of speaks to just how different and diverse and all the different dynamics at play within each one of these states. You can't just pin things on one thing.
Yeah, it's kind of a sine wave. What do you think about DC? I mean, really high, the highest participation rate, but still pretty high unemployment. And that's such a, kind of big government town. I wonder what's behind that.
Yeah, I think that's also like many of the wealthiest zip codes in the country are right in that area too. I don't know, I think that probably says something if that's when that's the case, that the richest people all live near DC is probably a strange thing. Okay, so before we get into the real heart of it, I thought this is important to maybe just casually talk about as well. So we saw that just as a TRO was placed on the public sector vaccine mandate in New York City, a new private sector vaccine mandate was just proposed, which kicks in, I think, later this month. So if it goes through, every private sector employee that's not working from home will have to be vaccinated, and the conditions for vaccination have been ramped up across the board as well. So given that we have an outgoing mayor and another incoming one that I think is not as, with this particular program, do you think this is going to come to pass, or do you think it's going to get blocked before it comes into effect?
I mean, I feel like he must have known that this was going to get challenged and blocked on his way out. And Eric Adams is not likely to be quite as progressive as de Blasio is on some of this.
Not even close. Yeah, so we'll see. But I mean, if you're a restaurant, and before you were probably thinking you might sort of be okay, but now that's a pretty big deal all of a sudden, where every single one of your staff has to be there. Okay. Last little tidbit before we jump in. This was a sort of interesting as well. Have you seen this? They have ACE2 gum. This is fascinating. So some research, I think this is University of Pennsylvania, I forget exactly where, have come up with a cinnamon flavored chewing gum that emulates the ACE2 receptors of your cell. So the ACE2 is sort of the binding spot where the spike protein from COVID interfaces with your cell and allows it to gain entry into your cell and infect you. So this gum apparently emulates ACE2, and that's created from plant protein, and it sort of tricks COVID into thinking that the gum itself are our cells, and instead of infecting your cells, it just sort of infects the gum as well. And you can see just how extraordinary the level of reduction is.
So you can just spit it out, you can just spit COVID out?
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't know if that means you have to be eating gum 24 hours a day to remain protected. Do you have to like be constantly chewing and chewing and chewing and chewing? And maybe it's only for stuff that enters through your mouth. I don't know, but it's pretty amazing what science is able to accomplish. Okay, that is neither here nor there. I thought I would just lead with maybe the single most important, actually this is the second most important announcement of today. We're gonna build up to the first most important announcement in just a little bit, which is this is a bi-weekly webinar, but there's a little bit of a fib because there are two dates this year that we don't have webinars. One was a few weeks ago during Thanksgiving, and we will also not have a webinar on December 23rd because honestly, none of you would show up, nor should you show up that close to the holiday. So please do not come here on December 23rd. Zoom may or may not send you a reminder. I don't think it's going to try to send you a reminder, but if it does, please remember what I'm saying now. Do not show up on December 23rd. And of course, this is really all about your input, your feedback, your sharing of thoughts and experiences and things that you see from around the world and in your home cities with the rest of this community. So please hit that chat button and maybe just take a moment right now. Let us know where you are chatting in from and choose the all panelists and attendees option, or it might just say everyone, depending on what version of Zoom you're on. And just say hi to everyone else in the food industry, all of your peers, colleagues. Let them know where you're coming in from. And with that, Mark, I thought we could just go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about Omicron in a little bit. But we wanted to start with just some background knowledge on inflation. And this comes from some of the great work, Mark, that you and your team, the rest of the content team is doing here at Datassential. That becomes part of our Report Pro package. So if you have access to Report Pro, you can get some of the latest data there already. But I just wanted to share a couple of highlights from some recent things that we learned. So one, basically everyone in this country right now has acknowledged that they've seen, real signs of rising prices, and 5 out of 6 consumers today, that is a pretty hefty majority, are now concerned about inflation. These are sharp rises from, I think, the last time we talked about inflation, which was back, maybe April? We sort of did an initial look.
May, yeah.
Yeah, April or May, and you started seeing some indications that the consumers are getting a little bit skittish. It's now full blown at this point. And when we ask people, well, where are you seeing higher food costs or menu prices in particular? This is where consumers are seeing them. And this is just of consumers that visit those types of venues. So the way you read this is, of people that ever buy groceries at the supermarket, 74% of them have noticed that prices have gotten higher, right? So there's this notion of just noticeable differences, which is, how much can the price of something go up and before consumers finally actually notice that it's gotten there. We've blown way through that level already, where regardless of the type of place that serves food, typically a majority or a vast majority of consumers that visit that channel say, yeah, I've noticed things getting to be more expensive. So it is not something in the back of people's heads. It's at the forefront of their thought at this point. And this was interesting too. How long do you think this inflationary period we're in is going to last? Well, no one thinks it's going to be over anytime soon. No one thinks that, December ends and we're back to the way things were. You have a lot of people thinking this is going to go into 2023 and beyond. Right?
Yeah, 10% of those folks in that last bar say permanently. They don't expect this environment to really ever abate.
Yeah, so I think consumers are bracing themselves for this a little bit. And, if inflation itself is partially a reflection of demand, which is a reflection of consumer sentiment, there could be somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy to all this too. So I think any thought that we're going to go through a couple more months of inflation and things recede, that seems unlikely if consumers themselves are correct. And this is the thing that was most interesting and maybe a little shocking to me is 80% of consumers think it's going to get worse than it is right now. So maybe they're wrong, who knows? But consumers are certainly bracing for this. And I think once you're in that mindset of, hey, we think prices are going to go up, you start noticing it a bit more. You become a little bit more attenuated to it. So consumers will start noticing. Now, that's not to say everyone should start doing, all value items or anything like that. I think that was a big mistake in 2009 when certainly the restaurant industry shifted toward that model, but just know that consumers are probably going to have their radars a little more acutely fine-tuned to detect changes in prices when they do happen. And this is something we should all know. Where will consumers cut back if inflation worsens? So I guess there are two things I would call out here. One, there are a broad variety of categories of spending where consumers say, hey, this is something I would cut back on. And two, that restaurant meals are at the top of that list. Now, that's not to say that restaurant meals are, way more impacted than any other category, because you have clothing right there, just a few percentage points behind, live entertainment, travel, grocery stores are a little bit behind, but restaurant meals are at the top of the list. Maybe not by a massive margin, but it's certainly a category that'll be impacted. And if you look historically, food service visitation is often well correlated with available discretionary income. So if inflation robs people of some of that, we should look to see the restaurant industry make some adjustments accordingly, because it's something that consumers will be sensitive to.
Jack, on this score here, one thing that's different from this question in May and now, so restaurant meals and clothing jumped the most from those 5 months ago to now. And actually the total percentage for things like live entertainment and shows and travel, those were the same. So really the rank order and then the percentage growth is going to be most noticeable here for restaurants. And I think the other big thing between now and back over the summer, I think a lot of it has to do with the increase in gasoline prices. People are noticing that and spending a lot more on that a lot right now. And so, prices are going up everywhere, but when it's on something like gasoline to this degree that they can't really replace and go without, I think that's what's driving a lot of, restaurant meals kind of getting the short end of the stick.
So actually, I want to ask everyone in chat, what is the most expensive price you've seen for a gallon of gas recently? Has anyone seen $6 gas? I know we've blown way through 5 in some areas. Have we seen 6 yet?
I saw a couple of 5.5 from some people. I don't know where they are though.
I have to think that in parts of LA, it's gotten close to 6. I know there's this one super expensive gas station. It was a 76 station, like on the corner of Wilshire and Santa Monica, I think. And it was always like 50 cents more expensive than any place else. I don't know why. I think it was considered like, you're considered like a really cool person if you could afford gas over there or something. I don't know. It was ridiculous. But I wonder if anyone's seen $6 gas. Even
with all those Teslas on the road?
That is true. Yeah, that is true. It seems like every other car there is a Tesla in LA. The inflation data and more on labor shortage and some things happening in the economy, and certainly things that are going to touch much of the industry. You'll find all of this inside of Report Pro, which I'm glad to say many of your companies are currently subscribing to. We have a ton of new content in Report Pro as well, and I wanted to just share a couple of those that you might want to take a look out for the next time you're in the system. One, a deep dive into what's happening in the C&U segment, which you can imagine has obviously been in an incredible state of flux and change and has a new roadmap going forward. So if you are working in C&U or you're a supplier to C&U, this is a must read, and it's available right now in Report Pro. And the other is our preview of 2022 trends. This is a Food Bites edition. It's a fantastic look at everything that's happening with future food. It gets into all sorts of really funky stuff, including the metaverse and what that might mean for food and food service. And it is also available right now as a preview of a much larger deep dive into trends that'll be published in the near future as well. So definitely give a look at both of these. And that trends piece, we have so many things that we think can be massive in 2022 and beyond that we're kicking off next year with a 2-part, webinar season kickoff, all about trends. The first webinar is going to be about really the big picture stuff, and the second webinar is going to be about some of the more specific things and particular influences and flavors and things to look out for. You really should make it to both. And we are doing a thing too, where there will be a brand new link for these webinars going forward. Today is the very last day that the current webinar link that you've been using for the last year and a half or so will still be valid. It is invalid after today's session. There is a brand new webinar link going forward, and you all should register right now. So I'm actually going to take 3 minutes, because if it takes us longer than that, then we're not doing something right. I'm going to ask all of you to visit the link I'm about to display, and please sign up for the 2022 webinar series. It'll be just like this one every 2 weeks. If you do that right now, so we can make sure everyone makes it over, that would be a big help. This will also help us stamp out the Patrick Carroll issue that we've had for a long time. So I'm asking everyone right now, literally right now, I don't mean an hour from now or 5 minutes from now, I mean right now, take 1 minute and visit nomorepatrick.com and sign up for the new webinar series that begins early next month. And Kendra, if you want to reappear yourself, I know you disappeared yourself for a second. So Kendra is here to monitor how good of a job we're doing in signing up for the new webinar series. So on a percentage basis, in maybe like a minute, Kendra, could you give us an update as to how many people have successfully gone to nomorepatrick.com and signed up? So let's
I sure can. Numbers are looking good so far.
Looking good so far. All right, let's give them 60 seconds and see where we are. I'm hoping we could make it to 75 or 80% of the folks here. We'll do it in the next minute, and then maybe the remaining 20% will take another 30 seconds or so. But again, this webinar we're on right now, this link will no longer work after today. So if you want access to any of this stuff going forward, and there's a ton we're gonna have for 2022, you gotta go to nomorepatrick.com literally right now and get signed up. Share this link with, share that nomorepatrick.com link with all of your colleagues, get them signed up too, and make sure you send them this link so they sign themselves up. The reason we found out that we had the entire Patrick Carroll virus, which became, you know, more than an annoyance at some point, is because people were sharing the actual link to the specific webinar post-registration. Everyone needs to register themselves so you don't end up basically making copies of yourself. So Patrick Carroll just happened to be a particular link that got replicated over and over and over and over and over again, and ended up becoming at some point 60% of our webinar attendees were, you know, misattributed Patrick Carroll. This will eliminate it. Kendra, how are we doing?
Just refreshing my page now and making sure everyone still has a link. So I put it in the chat again. And let's see, right now we are at 53%, over half.
We're over half. We will continue on right now, but if you're in the midst of filling it out, keep doing it. If you haven't yet, please do so right now. Kendra's going to continue to spam the chat channel with both links so you can register either way.
Yeah, there's a movement to also ban Patrick from SpongeBob and Patrick Swayze. So I think we've started a movement here.
Good point.
Right.
You want to disappear yourself again? You may join us again later though. So just put yourself on.
For my final magic trick.
Thank you. I don't know if this is sort of interesting. Where do people actually get their information about COVID? Did this surprise you, Mark? Just sort of what the top source, like the question is, what is your #1 source for information about COVID?
What really surprised me was the higher percentage than I would have thought for local news. You know, local broadcasts being at the top there kind of shocked me, to be honest.
It did too. Yeah, I feel the same way, because normally, I mean, those segments aren't particularly long. It's like a 2-minute thing and then they move on to another topic, right?
Yeah, well, I think they're probably dependent on the national affiliates for a lot of it too. But I just didn't really know that there are still that many people watching local news.
But you know what it is? It does tell you what's happening in your neighborhood, right? Like what the infection rates look like nearby, which you can't get from the national stuff. But you can see it's a pretty wide spread of sources, and you can certainly imagine, for those of you that want to stick around after the official end of the hour, we'll have some bonus content where we took some of those key media sources and we cross-tab some of the other attitudes toward COVID based on where people get their COVID information from. And it's actually fairly interesting to see, right? You know, what does it mean for someone who's a Fox viewer versus a CNN or MSNBC viewer versus someone that gets their information online? So at the end of the hour, if you want to stick around for a couple more minutes, we'll show you some of that data too. So I thought this was pretty interesting. This is the Greek alphabet. I never took Greek in high school, but I've seen the alphabet a couple of times. And if you look at where we were, the last named variant we had was mu. And then you see that you have nu, and then you have G, and then you have Omicron. But we actually skipped right over 2 letters, right? It's supposed to go sequentially when we name variants: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc. And you could see why we did that, right? It's interesting. We're just like, we're not going to do new because people get confused, because it's going to sound like, you know, new sounds like the word new, which could be very, very confusing. It's like almost like who's on first or something. And then she, which, you know, the WHO, I guess, said that maybe it's a common surname and we didn't want to offend people, or maybe it's the, you know, name of the leader of China, and we didn't want to offend him in particular. So we just jumped straight to Omicron, which is a, I guess, admittedly, way cooler sounding name for a variant. So let's take a look at some of the things that we've learned from Omicron. So I wanted to share maybe just, this is not Datassential data in this case, but just a little bit of a background. And I'll say one, Mark is not a doctor. I am not a doctor. Please do not construe any of what we're about to say as being medical advice, and definitely don't listen to us for medical advice. But we wanted to share just some of the reporting that we've seen that we think provides a good background. So Omicron is different from the other variants, because you can see there is just a stark difference in the number of mutations in the S1 spike protein that Omicron has. Omicron is the red in this case versus all the major preceding variants before it. It's like on a whole different part of the chart and disconnected with everything else. And you probably have all heard this, that Omicron has something like 30+ mutations in the spike protein, whereas Delta only had, you know, 9 mutations in the spike protein. So you can see all those mutations on the left. The red areas are spike protein mutations in particular. That is a lot of mutations, and it also means that it is dissimilar. You know, the more mutations you have, the more dissimilar you are from previous variants. And there's the question of, well, if it's dissimilar from the previous variant, does it mean that the things that we put together to fight the earlier variants, will they be less effective against Omicron because it's not the same thing anymore? And there are a number of questions that we're trying to answer. And I think the answers, you know, come a little bit more clearly into focus every single day, but there is no conclusive answer on any of this yet. But it seems like there is certainly evidence to show that one or more of these things is very likely to be true. And again, we'll learn more in the days or maybe weeks ahead. You know, it seems very probable that Omicron is much more transmissible. It is potentially possible that it targets younger people. You see way higher levels of infectivity in South Africa among people under the age of 50, and in younger cohorts, that is, you know, way over indexed to the age of the general population there. But then it could also be because those tend to be the less vaccinated groups as well. So we don't really quite know yet, but it looks like maybe it targets younger people a little bit more effectively. There's very likely some immune escape properties of this, that it could dodge vaccines, or may even be able to dodge natural immunity to some extent. And that all sounds pretty bad, but the potentially good news of this is that it could be a whole lot less severe than the previous variants. Again, we don't know for sure yet, but that does look like where things are pointing to. And with that context in mind, we want to understand what people think about Omicron. And, you know, this is changing so incredibly fast that we need to date this research. This is as of the end of last week is when we fielded this survey with consumers. So I think in just the last 4 or 5 days, more information has surfaced. So I'm guessing some of these attitudes have shifted a little bit since, but directionally, I think this is still pretty bang on. So number one, will Omicron change certain types of behavior? I think the answer is a little bit, right? So will Omicron change your holiday travel in some way? And this doesn't mean that you're going to cancel your holiday travel. Doesn't mean you're going to shift your dates. It might mean that it's just going to be a shorter trip, or it might mean that you're staying in a different type of hotel or something, or you're not going to be with as many people at one time. But about a quarter of folks said, yes, I'm probably going to be changing my travel plans in some way, shape, or form. Now, this is a far cry from, let's say, like the original onset of COVID, where the answer was like 100%. But there is a little bit of impact there in holiday travel. What was more interesting to us, though, is when we look at that tracker, right? There's those questions being tracking since the beginning of COVID. One of which is, how concerned are you personally, for your own personal health as it relates to coronavirus? We did not see an uplift in concern really as Omicron sort of, became a little bit more well-known. That number sort of sat there. It's at 45%. It is not at a level that is higher or terribly dissimilar from where it's been in the weeks and months leading up until right now. So people aren't much more concerned about their health as it relates to Omicron, at least not as of the end of last week. And I would go on to say that I think things were actually scarier because there was less known about this variant last week than they are this week. Mm-hmm. We did want to break this down a little bit, though. And this is not an Omicron specific insight, but if you ask folks, hey, are you really concerned about your own personal health? People in urban areas are just way more concerned overall. So this is, from the latest data, so this reflects Omicron. But if you go back historically, for the last several months or a couple of years, you'll see the same pattern emerge in every single time period where people in urban areas just tend to be a lot more concerned about their own personal health as it relates to COVID than are people in suburban or rural areas. And there is a piece of news specifically for the restaurant industry, and I think it's really quite encouraging, which is that other tracking question. Are you definitely avoiding eating out? We didn't see an uptick in more people saying, hey, I definitely don't want to go out to eat anymore, right? In fact, we're at our lowest levels of eating out avoidance that we've seen since the very beginning of COVID, right? We've hit essentially an all-time low going all the way back to the middle of March 2020. We're at 24%, which is lower than any other level that we've seen. So Omicron has not spooked people into staying away from restaurants, at least not that we've seen so far. And I think if the news continues to be good and encouraging around severity of the disease, we should be in fairly good shape as far as the restaurant industry goes. Mark, I don't know if you have an observation here or a reaction.
A couple things. So one is that the lowest level of avoidant behavior that I saw looking through these crosstabs was the Millennial Generation. And what's different about that from back at the very start of the pandemic when the first kind of reading we took, the highest levels of concern were people in urban areas and millennials. But now, I think that that group of people, is just sort of more, resigned to dealing with this virus. I think a lot of them they have high rates of vaccination, so they feel like they're doing, as much as they possibly can to kind of get on with their lives and still address this virus.
Yeah, I think so. I think some people are like, hey, I've been dealing with this for a while. I know how to manage it at this point. It's going to take something really crazy to scare me back into my house. Yeah. And even when there was a lot of uncertainty about what Omicron was last week, people still said, yeah, it hasn't really changed me very much. In fact, 76% say I'm not definitely avoiding eating out at this point.
Yeah, among the folks that are, pro-vaccination and that have always kind of planned to inoculate themselves, most of them are boosted now. If they're parents like I am, their kids are vaccinated now. So I think that's the real tailwind that we have, is just that there are much higher rates of vaccination for everybody now.
Yeah, let's hold that thought. We're going to talk about boosters in a little bit, which will be an interesting conversation. Sure. I invite everyone to get involved in share your own personal thoughts. That's what we're here for. So this was interesting to me, that urban, suburban, rural crosstab that we saw for Are You Concerned About COVID, where you have a big difference in concern based on the types of area that you live. There's no difference when it comes to whether you're avoiding eating out. They're the same, urban, suburban, rural. It's always sort of like in that low to mid 20s number. When it comes to risk concern, though, there's a strong discrepancy in between urban and rural areas. In terms of whether you're going to eat out, not so much. So I think what that sort of says to me is people want to get food from restaurants, even if they think there's probably just some general risk in their area and risk to themselves. It's just an important thing to people that they're just going to do it anyways. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter what your perception of risk is, in the long run. At some point, it equalizes, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to do it. And that's why we see the numbers be so consistent across urban, suburban, and rural areas. This is sort of interesting too. We took a stab at cross-tabbing this as well, based on people's vaccination status. People that are already vaxxed, people that aren't vaxxed yet, but say they plan to, and those who say they do not plan to get vaccinated. And it's sort of interesting, right? And I think it's sort of predictable. People that are already vaccinated, despite being already vaccinated, are the ones that are most concerned about their own personal COVID risk, right? Not theoretically in general. This is like, hey, given who you are and and what your life is right now, how personally concerned about COVID, the people that are vaccinated are still the ones that are most concerned. Now, you could look at the flip side and say, well, it's not that they're more concerned, it's just the people that never plan to get vaccinated were never concerned in the first place, which is why that number is so low. And that's certainly possible too. But you see a pretty stark difference there. And here you actually do see a little bit more of a difference in whether people are avoiding eating out, right? The people that said, yeah, I don't plan on getting, I'm not vaccinated, I don't plan on getting vaccinated, they never really had that much of a concern about it. Those that are already vaccinated are actually twice as likely to be avoiding eating out than those that aren't vaxxed and don't plan to get vaxxed. So we're also seeing, as you've noted in the past, Mark, that it's basically a coin flip right now in terms of whether people perceive this to be more about a health crisis or an economic crisis. And we do some of those crosstabs. You could probably guess pretty well what's going to determine which side of the coin a specific person is going to land on. But it is a 50-50 thing right now. And you'll actually see some of this, I think, in the media consumption data, if you stick around for the bonus content, where depending on where you get your news from, that has a pretty strong correlation. I won't say impact, because you don't know if there's causation there, but certainly a correlation with whether you think it's a health crisis or an economic crisis. Now, this is the thing that shocked me the most and is actually frightening to me, which is half the country still thinks that the worst of the pandemic is still to come. I can't rationalize this. I mean, know that we asked this question at the end of last week when Omicron was very new and very spooky. So this could reflect, people just in the moment saying, oh my God, something terrible is about to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but it might be coming. But it blows me away, even with that potentially on the horizon, at the time, that half the country would still think that there's more bad stuff to come than we've had leading up to today. Was that not a surprise to you, Mark?
No, not really. I mean, I think that these numbers are up a little bit. So last time we asked this a few months ago, 53% said the worst was behind us. But we'll see kind of what Omicron is doing to the pessimism. I mean, that's what's driving a lot of this.
So what worse thing could happen at this point? Like, what are people, I mean, that you've seen saying could happen that would be so much worse than what's already happened?
Well, I mean, I think that it's the difference, I think, between transmissibility and then severity, and the likelihood to lead to, hospitalization and death. If we see that this is more transmissible, but not too severe, especially among the vaccinated, then, I think we can deal with that. I think the optimism will kind of improve there. But if it takes a turn and we see, more severe consequences, then that tracks to me too.
So we've been in this for almost 2 years now. If you're someone that believes that the worst is still to come, does that mean that you believe that it's going to be multiple additional years of the state that we're in or worse?
I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking that, right?
That is amazing to me. So I would not have guessed that, but I guess that's the way people think. So maybe they're right. Who knows? Now, some of this is an Omicron impact, right? 75% say Omicron has influenced my pessimism that the worst of the pandemic is still to come. So I think you're seeing that's part of the reason why you're seeing that lift. And about 40% say they plan to be more vigilant with precautions they could take in their own life, whether it's distancing or wearing a mask or going back to some of the earlier behaviors. I don't know if I've seen this fully manifest just yet. I think people are still on the fence a little bit about whether this would actually need to happen, because this is still so early when we started asking these questions. But people are prepared, or many people are prepared to take, more aggressive measures in mitigating their exposure to the disease if it comes down to it. And this was interesting to me too. We asked people, and for each one of these items, you could say, I support it or I don't support it. And the condition is, if we saw a significant increases here in cases, as well as hospitalizations, so not just transmission, but also severity. If we saw a significant increase here, what measures would you support? And these are the percentage of people that say I would support. So one, it's a majority in every single case. And 4 out of 5 people say travel restrictions, I'd support it. 4 out of 5 say additional stimulus to citizens. Well, I think everyone probably wants some of that because you get some money for yourself. Stimulus for business as well. But what's interesting is you go all the way down the list, even though it's still a majority thing that is least supported among the types of measures that might be considered are closing indoor dining. People don't want that, nearly as much want that option to go away. And also requiring vaccination to dine inside restaurants and bars. So, there is sort of a spectrum of things that people are broadly supportive of and things that they're more narrowly supportive of. And the stuff that impacts restaurants tends to be at the other end of the spectrum. Now, I would say they are open to distancing inside of restaurants. They just don't want the entire option to go away for them or someone that chose not to get vaccinated. But we'll see.
The further down that list you go, the more the split between the kind of pro-vaccination, already vaccinated folks, and the hesitant, or set against vaccination folks, those differences get much more stark the further down that list we go.
Yeah, and look, this might be moot because the precondition that we offered here about it being a major increase in cases and hospitalizations may or may not come true. But if it did, this is what people would support. Okay, so what we're seeing now is that it looks like transmissibility is up for the reason that we talked about. So one of those spike protein mutations, I think the count is there's up to maybe 37 S1 spike protein mutations that we know of so far. One of them is a mutation that carried over from the common cold, apparently, which is making Omicron, one of the things that makes Omicron more immediately transmissible. But it really looks like severity from everything we've seen so far. Now, this could all change in a heartbeat. That severity, if you get it, is much lower, right? And you can look at some of this in some of the data from the Gauteng province in South Africa, right? So the dotted line is the number of, the dashed line is the number of cases, and the solid line is the number of deaths. And you've seen with each previous wave where a new variant came in, you'd see obviously the cases go up, but you'd see some increase in mortality as well. Here, you don't see that. You see cases rapidly accelerating. I think the R value in Gauteng, they said was as high as 3.5, which is, very, very high. But no one's having that super severe outcome so far. And total deaths, as reported deaths that we know of so far from Omicron across the world, at least as of this morning, I think, and hopefully for a long time after, I think is 0 still. So Again, we can't be absolutely certain, but the signs are pretty encouraging that severity is lower. The doctor that sort of treated many of the early Omicron patients in South Africa, I mean, her first report was that severity was much lower and that the symptoms themselves were different too, which is interesting, right? I think some of the symptoms of Omicron are things like body ache and things that were not typically symptomatic, typically symptoms you'd find from other variants of COVID. So it seems like it is a little bit different. And thankfully, it looks like so far it's less severe. Now, the people that are getting infected tend to be on the younger side. So the reduced mortality rate could be because they're just, less likely to have gotten really, really sick from regular COVID anyways, because they're younger. So we don't know entirely for sure yet, but I think most, if not all the signs so far point to this being less severe. So let's keep our fingers crossed and hope that is the case. And I'm gonna ask you all a question in a moment, but I'm gonna ask you a more important question right now. And I'd like you to just answer yes or no. Have you already signed up for the new webinar at nomorepatrick.com? And note that the second option is no, but I'm going to do it right now. So as soon as you vote no, please go to nomorepatrick.com and complete your registration so we can get that out of the way. I'll give this a few more seconds. You all get the point. If you don't transfer over to the new one, you're going to lose access for good. So please go to nomorepatrick.com already if you haven't already, and let us be on our way. Okay, so most of you said you've done it, which is great. Nomorepatrick.com. If you haven't already, do it now, please. And this is what we've seen more recently as well. So this is a test of the presence of neutralizing antibodies. And you could sort of see Omicron versus a preceding variant of COVID. And this is a logarithmic scale, right? So it's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, et cetera on the left-hand axis. And the numbers you see at the top are the mean number of neutralizing antibodies detected. But keep in mind, this is off a very small sample. This is off, I think, like 12 or 14 people or something, right? So this is not a super in-depth, detailed study. But it is fairly sophisticated in that we have real levels of testing among those subjects. That there were basically 40 times more detectable neutralizing antibodies for previous waves of COVID, for a previous wave of COVID than we have versus Omicron for people that have been vaccinated with Pfizer. And I think Pfizer then came out yesterday and said, well, this is why you need a third dose, because it will essentially multiply your antibody levels by like 25 and get you pretty close to where you were pre-Omicron with just 2 doses of Pfizer. So this is 2 doses of Pfizer, the level of detectable neutralizing antibodies for Omicron, which is 32, versus a prior variant of COVID, which is 1,300. It's a 40-fold reduction that we're seeing. The Pfizer people say, hey, if you get another dose, you'll be almost right back up to where you were before. But this is one of the reasons why the notion of immune escape, that this variant will be able to dodge vaccines, or at least 2 doses of the vaccine, does remain a concern. So more transmissible, potentially can dodge, can escape a vaccine. And what's interesting too, and again, this is a preprint, and we're going to show you some other things that are preprints as well. This study about reinfection. So if you've already had COVID, how likely are you to be reinfected with Omicron, was done via a combination of data and then mathematical modeling. And what they found was that there is a higher risk of reinfection with Omicron than there was with the Beta or the Delta variants. So for Beta and Delta, there was not an observable increased risk in reinfection versus the original strain. But with Omicron, they're seeing a higher risk of reinfection. So if you already had COVID, you're not very likely to get reinfected based on all the other data, but you're a little bit more likely to in the case of Omicron. I think it was something like a 2.4 times increase in the likelihood of reinfection. But again, this is just one study out of many that's going to be conducted in the near future, and we should wait a couple of weeks before we really know. So it looks like there is evidence that Omicron can dodge both vaccines and to some extent prior infection, immunity from prior infection as well, right? So here's the conclusion from that study: substantial ability to evade immunity from prior infection. In contrast, there was no population-wide epidemiological evidence of immune escape associated with either beta or delta. So Omicron is different, it looks like, so far in that respect, because it is mutated so much. Then you start looking at some other evidence coming in. So this is not about Omicron, but there's been this sort of debate about immunity and where it comes from. And we wanted to ask consumers what they think of as well. And to give us just a little bit of a, setting the table for it, I want to share maybe some of the pieces of evidence that those that advocate for something like natural immunity will often point to and say, well, here's evidence that natural immunity is, as good or better than a vaccine or pretty close to it or something. So here's a study from a recent study. I think this is November 24th, just a couple of weeks ago, from Qatar, 260,000 people that had a PCR confirmed infection. Of those people, about 1,300, about 0.5%, came down with a reinfection. So that's pretty rare. So it's like 0.5%. Of those 1,339, 1,300 were then followed up with to see what their outcome was. And of those 1,300, 4 ended up having some sort of a severe outcome, severe disease. No one died from it. So if you look at the final numbers, it's something like 0.0015% of people that previously had COVID ended up with a severe outcome from a reinfection. Pretty small, right? So if you're trying to protect against severe infection, this severe outcome, this shows 99.9985, I guess, percent efficacy. Here's a study from Israel that's often been cited. And again, we're not saying one thing is good and one thing's not good. We're just pointing out some of the pieces of evidence that some in the culture have pointed to. And I would actually sort of ask anyone in chat if you know of any studies that have basically, not like news reports, but actual studies that have found that natural immunity is not a thing. We'd love you to post it and we could see. But here's an Israeli study that found that natural immunity is strong and confers longer lasting and stronger protection than vaccination. Here's one that was just published by researchers at Harvard, where one of the side effects of the study that we're doing, one of the side pieces of data that found is that no one in the sample set ended up with a reinfection at all, right? You had basically 100% protection, at least among that group. If you had COVID again, no one else got COVID again after that. And then there's an interesting study from early in the summer from the Cleveland Clinic, where I think this is like 56,000 healthcare workers, some number like that. 1,300 of them had previously had COVID, chose not to get vaccinated. And over the period of the study, which was a few months, none of them got reinfected. And what's interesting here is after this was published, and they came to the conclusion that if you previously had an infection, you're unlikely to benefit from a vaccine. You can imagine that stirred up all sorts of conversation in the public. And a couple days later, they released a statement saying, we stand by our study basically, but you should get vaccinated anyways. So you could read into that as you will. And then we want to understand from consumers, given this and lots of other news and lots of other things, do people believe in natural immunity, and how should that shape our policy around whether we can go back into restaurants or not, or whether vaccination should be required? And I guess I was a little surprised that it was so split down the middle. The question that we asked is, do you believe that COVID recovery provides natural immunity, which protects against future infection? It's like half-half, basically. Mm-hmm. Is this what you were expecting, Mark, or did you think you'd be more skewed to one side?
I thought that the number of people who agree would have been a little bit higher, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, it's definitely lower than I would have thought. Now, what's interesting is even among, if people that already had COVID, 3 out of 4 agree, but that means still 25% of them still don't think that it was quite enough. So you have sort of a 50-50 split. And I think if we start looking at where people consume their COVID information from, it plays a significant role in our perceptions of things. Now, of those who do believe in natural immunity, they think it's pretty strong, right? 46% think that of people that believe in natural immunity, 46% of them think that it's more protective than vaccines. Another one, 41% thinks it's just as good as a vaccine. That's almost 90%, 87% cumulatively of those who believe in natural immunity think it's as good as a vaccine or better. So I think this is why you see so much public debate about things like vaccine mandates and whether they should be there or not, because you have roughly half the country that believes in natural immunity, and 90% of those people think that it's as good or better than a vaccine, and they're questioning why a vaccine would be mandated then, if that were the case. This takes us into a conversation around boosters. And I'm not monitoring chat, Mark, but I actually think it would be interesting. I have not found myself, and probably because I haven't gone searching too much for it, any studies that have sort of said that natural immunity, definitely wanes after a certain period of time or isn't quite as productive as we would need it to be to get to some level of herd immunity or whatever. Has anyone found anything that they could post or in chat?
I haven't seen any links come through yet, but there's definitely some pretty spirited back and forth about it.
I'm scared to look at the chat later, but okay, well, keep that spirit up. We want the conversation, but please don't attack one another. That would be very bad. But if any of you can actually point to—
no. This is better than the Thanksgiving dinner table argument. It's actually going pretty well.
Yeah, that's good. So we'll stay cordial about it. And I appreciate the fact that we're able to do these types of things in this webinar, and everyone's so nice to each other. But if anyone can find a study or a piece of evidence that sort of refutes the natural immunity claim, it would be great to share that as well. We'd love to see it. Okay, so let's talk about boosters if we can. So among people that are already vaccinated or plan to get vaccinated, 24% say they've already gotten a booster, and another 60% say they plan to. Only 15% don't plan to. I was actually surprised. I thought this would be closer to like a 50-50 split, with one half of the vaccinated population saying, I'm good, I'm done. Like 85% or 84% plan to continue on with boosters or have already done so. Did you find that surprising, or did you expect this to be the case?
No, I mean, I would have thought that, if you've already gotten over your hesitation, you've already kind of gotten over whatever priors might have kept you from getting the first shot, I think that you're likely to kind of go along with the recommended third or, subsequent ones.
I was I got to say, I was surprised because you hear more personality saying, okay, I was good with the first one, I was good with the second one, but yeah, I'm sort of good at this point. But I guess that hasn't really trickled down to the broader population. If you're on the vaccination train, most people are just continuing with it through to the next stop.
Yeah, there were a couple of ways that we asked throughout the survey, the degree to which you're kind of over this. And it's a pretty low percentage of people that are just kind of over it, won't really do or won't consider further steps. The folks that are just kind of done with COVID response, it's really around that, 17 to 18% of people, which is about the same percentage we see consistently of, set against vaccination and all of that. So, really 4 out of 5 people are still kind of with the program and will at least consider doing what's being recommended.
And 3 out of 4 say they're willing to just keep doing it every 6 months, potentially in perpetuity, which surprised me too that number was so strong. But that's good. People are committed to doing that. Now, you have the flip side of people that say, yeah, I'm not so sure about the vaccine. I haven't gotten it and I probably don't want to get it. If you ask them, does the emergence of Omicron make you reconsider getting vaccinated? You have a little bit of movement. Only 8% though say, yeah, I definitely will reconsider, and I'm probably getting a little bit more vaccine now than I used to be. You have 30% that is a maybe. I'm guessing that is a very loose maybe in this case. It may not manifest into actual action. The vast majority are either a maybe, and the majority are just no. Even with Omicron, you haven't changed my mind. So what would it mean to actually be fully vaccinated. I mean, ask yourself what it means, so what you think it means, but this is what consumers say. 56% say that you're fully vaccinated if you got the original 2 doses. 44% say, no, you're not fully vaccinated unless you're also current on all of the recommended boosters. So you can sort of see there continues to be fissure after fissure after fissure where people draw lines in terms of what they think an appropriate level of action or responsibility is, right? Should you be vaccinated in the first place? If you are vaccinated, at what point do you draw the line and say, okay, I've done enough? There's like a lot of 50-50 splits throughout all these issues. And it's sort of interesting, if you break this down by different sort of demographic cohorts or vaccine status, you see some interesting things. Boomers are more likely to say you got to be current on all of your boosters. And the people that plan to get vaccinated but haven't been vaccinated yet, they're way more likely to say, you know what, you just need the first 2 doses. I'm already behind. I can't catch up all the way. I think that's just a situation where they don't want to keep doing it forever.
Well, what's sort of concerning or unhelpful about all this is that of all the different kind of mandates that are out there, I don't know if they are addressing boosters in some of these proposed rules, right? Are they going to require the 3rd or the recommended 4th, or just the first 2, just the 1 of J&J? Like, that's
if someone in chat can maybe look it up, but I think the New York City proposed mandate brings boosters into that equation.
Oh, it does?
I believe it does. Maybe someone wants to look it up or do a quick Google and post it in chat, but I believe it actually does. So I want to maybe ask you all a question. Given what we've sort of seen about consumer attitudes and what we know so far about Omicron, if you had to say yes or no, is it possible that Omicron will actually help lift us out of the pandemic? Meaning a lot more people get it, but it's not going to be that severe, and maybe it confers a lot more natural immunity to even a bigger chunk of the population, that maybe net, it's actually a positive development that we're shifting the profile of the typical COVID infection from Delta to a less severe Omicron that just happens to spread a lot more. Is this possibly something that gets us out of the pandemic in a relatively beneficial way? Mark, I'm not gonna...
Wasn't that pattern part of kind of what got us out of the 1919
That's a thought.
epidemic?
Yeah, that is a thought. That's what happened with Spanish flu as well. So I'm actually curious. I'm not going to ask you your personal opinion, Mark, because I feel like we got to be protective of some of those things. But what do you think people are voting? Do you think it's mostly yeses, mostly no's, or a split?
My guess would that it would be majority yes, probably not a huge consensus, but I bet you there's going to be at least a bare majority yes.
So far, it's not the case. It's a little bit closer to a split, but it's 60-40 in favor of the no's. So we shall see. We shall certainly see, but I think there's nothing to be super worried about yet. Now, there is certainly the possibility that we're going to have a lot more infections, and we have a country here that tends to be a little bit unhealthier than others, which will lead to greater level of hospitalizations. We may overrun the hospitals. Especially if things are growing this fast, because I think in South Africa, cases were doubling every 2 to 3 days. If you extrapolate that far enough, you get to a pretty big number. So let's say, you have, there's 12 2.5-day periods in a month. So 2 to the 12th is 4,096. You do that for 2 months straight, you get to 16 million. So you get to a 16 million fold increase in a period of 60 days, right? If you don't mitigate somehow. So that could be consequential, but if it's not that severe, maybe we'll come to just view this a different way and that gets us out. Who knows? Okay, so I wanted to end on a very positive note because we're talking about potentially depressing things, but I think there's maybe something good in all this, who knows? We asked consumers to, when you think about the year ahead, you think about 2022 and the next year of your life, what is the one word that comes to mind? And more than anything else, people said hope. I think they said it at least twice as much as any other word. So people have more hope than fear in their mind. I think a lot of people feel like they've been through quite a lot already and are looking with cautious optimism toward the future and a real sense of hope. And I think they derive a lot of that hope from some of the interactions they have. And many of those interactions come from things like the experiences we have at restaurants. So I just want to impress on all of us. We do, all of you do really, really important work that touches many, many millions of consumers' lives at the end of the day. And I think you play an important part in giving them the hope that's going to push us through this really, historically challenging, but very interesting period of our lives. A big thank you from myself and Mark and Kendra and the rest of the team at Datassential for sticking with us for such a long time. We're moving to season 4 of our webinars starting in January with our double hitter super trends deep dive. And if you want to be in on it, you need to go to nomorepatrick.com right now if you haven't already done so, or share this with all your colleagues. Actually, I want to, for all of you that have done it, I want you to share this link with at least 2 other colleagues before you finish work today. And let's get a really great group of folks on that new 2022 webinar. We're starting off talking about trends. Don't think we're going to be talking about COVID in the first couple. I hope we're not. We're going to talk about really awesome trend stuff that you need to know, big pictures first, and then some of the micro trends that are going to touch us in a very, very visceral way over the course of the next year and beyond. So the next Trends Extravaganza is on January 6th. Please do not show up on December 23rd. There'll be nothing here. But on Jan 6th, brand new link. Mike and Renee and some of our other trend experts are going to take us on an absolute tour of trends that will be utterly fascinating and important and essential.